Thank you for joining me for a prelude introduction to a series of concerts we're going to be giving at the end of this week. Friday night in Frostburg University, and Saturday evening and Sunday afternoon at the Maryland Theater. It's a concert that we're calling Mozart's 29th Symphony. That wonderful symphony is on the program, but it is in conversation with two other works that, although when you look at them initially, you don't see connections. What I love about building a program is that I find hidden connections, contextual connections, and sometimes thematic connections as well. And that's the fun part of building a program, one which will, I hope, interest the audience and involve them in the conversation that every single one of the pieces of music on the program have some sort of purpose of communication, and they're talking to each other as well as talking to the audience. So the first piece of music that we're playing is the suite from Pulcinella, the ballet that was written by Stravinsky in 1924, and from which he extracted a suite of movements from the ballet. It was a sung ballet. There were singers as well as dancers, and he took some of the arias and made them instrumental, and took a number of the instrumental works that had been danced and pulled it together in a suite that roughly follows the plot of the ballet, which Pulcinella refers to, of course, the commedia dell'arte, kind of puppet-like or comedic characters from the 17th century Italy, and that were very popular, became, the Punch and Judy of the 19th century, 18th and 19th centuries, and the Pierrots and Pierrettes, all of those sort of stereotyped, archetyped characters, usually lovelorn, usually mischievous, often finding tragic, but tragedy within comedy, tragic ends, but within comedy, and usually sneaky happy endings at the same time, as is the case of this Pulcinella ballet. Lots of mistaken identities, and well, it's all it's a romp. The suite itself allows Stravinsky, who is in a very interesting moment in his life. He has written three of the greatest pieces of the early 20th century: Firebird Ballet, three ballets, Firebird Ballet, Rite of Spring, Petrushka. For any composer, that earth-shaking, earth-shattering, historically cataclysmic kind of composition and reputation from that would put you on the map for the rest of your life. But he was still quite young, and he probably was surprised to find that he needed to go in a new direction. And this was by, as he said, looking into a musical mirror. Now, this musical mirror happened to be one of the early 18th century, late 17th, early 18th century. He looked back to the music of a composer that he thought was Pergolesi, but ended up being Pergolesi, Domenico Gallo, and Carlo Manza, and some other composers, including a 19th century usurper as well. These were all pieces in a collection of works that were attributed to Pergolesi. Pergolesi was a fine early 18th century composer, Baroque. This is the time of Baroque, early classical moment. Bach is still living, but his sons are starting to be in the ascendant, and we move to Leopold Mozart, and Mozart soon by the middle of the 18th century. But these are pieces that were earlier than Mozart, and they're absolutely gorgeous. But the publishers found that if they could all say that all these pieces were by the famous Pergolesi, who died young and therefore wasn't going to receive any residuals from the sales of any publications. And also very much like a great art, when you can attribute something to Van Gogh or Picasso or Vermeer, the price, the quality, everything is inflated of the work, even if it's a forgery or if it's not by, if it's by a student of one of those masters. In fact, Pergolesi wrote some of the work that you hear in Pulcinella, but much of it is written by these more anonymous composers. Now, they weren't anonymous in their day. They were highly regarded. And when you hear the music, you understand why. But they wrote in small forms. They wrote in trio sonatas. They did not write the grand operas or ballets that sort of stood the test of time. And so their names were lost to history. And someone gathered them up and just called it all music by Pergolesi. And Stravinsky believed that, at least we think that he believed that, at least at first, that these were pieces by Pergolesi. They are all quite lovely. And what Stravinsky does is not only appropriate them for himself, and also he's not plagiarizing. He attributes, of course, the music to someone else, but the way that he sets it, the way that he arranges it into this ballet and into this suite of orchestral suite is only Stravinsky could do. He changes the harmonies just slightly, especially when he's weaving one piece into the next by different composers. And in some ways, even though you know intellectually that the piece is by that the individual pieces, the melodies particularly, and most of the harmonies are by different composers, what Stravinsky manages to do is to make it all his own music. The forms themselves have titles that harken back to 18th century and even before. Gavotte, Serenata, Symphonia, Tarantella, and Minuetto, those kinds in aria, all of those forms harken back to ancient forms that were carried forward. And it is the actual act of looking backwards into history to find source material that can inspire and direct someone forward that is the miraculous thing about Pulcinella, because this then becomes his next great ballet. And it is in such a different style. It is not iconoclastic. It's not breaking down barriers and blowing raspberries at what has come in the past, but rather this is looking to the past with a great deal of gratitude and admiration, and allowing it to inform the modern sentiment. We hear modern harmonies, we hear modern juxtapositions, we hear a sense of the collage or the almost the art of Picasso, and let's not forget that Picasso was the director of art for this ballet, designed all of the scenery. And so the fact that Picasso and Stravinsky are working together, the music in some ways has a sense of the original now being shown in different perspectives at the same time. And it's about time, and it is also in some ways really engaging in the kind of work of Picasso, because we're also talking about putting something to look at it from a different perspective. At the very same time as you're hearing old music, you're hearing it in a context that is quite modern. The ballet itself was directed by the great Massine, who used the ancient dances as the beginnings of the choreography, so that there's this sense of sort of putting on an 18th century opera, but bringing it forward into a modern audience that would expect something that they could relate to. And here is where the modern minds of Picasso and Stravinsky and Racine and Diaghilev all come together, using techniques in dance that are modern, using sets that, while evoking ancient times, are absolutely modern. Picasso was one of the greats of the 20th century, and just the idea of having these amazing people coming together to put this production on, these are certainly once in a lifetime experiences for audience members. And so we begin our concert in the 18th century, but also an 18th century that is brought to life in the 20th century. And this is important because this is always what we are doing in music and in classical music and in what we do as a symphony orchestra, which is to bring the moments that are sort of frozen in time, that sort of express the experience of a certain time into the future by recreating it. And we can't help but recreate it now into the 21st century, where we can see that Stravinsky, hearkening back to the 18th century, is doing something that is something that even von Weber is doing in his concertino for clarinet, which you'll hear about in a little bit. And also Mozart is, on the other hand, is of the 18th century, and he is also pushing his form, the symphony, forward for more modern audiences. You'll hear about that in a little bit. But right now, I want to turn over the podium, so to speak, to our guest artist, Beverly Butts, who you'll hear from next. And it is my privilege to be joined by the principal clarinet of the Maryland Symphony Orchestra, Beverly Butts, who is also the soloist for this weekend's concerts. And Beverly has been with the orchestra since before my time. She came in with having been chosen by Maestro Tuckwell. And I would say that's high praise indeed, because he was very discerning about the musicians he wanted to work with. And also an amazing educator, recently received the award for outstanding faculty member at Lebanon Valley College. So she plays many roles in music as a teacher, as a performer, as a soloist, and as an amazing ensemble player as well. Beverly, welcome, or Bev. And we are going to perform the Weber Concertino. It's written in 1811, and one of the reasons I chose it was because it does have a connection to Mozart through the instrument itself, through the clarinet, because we know that Mozart wrote certainly the first most significant concerto for your instrument. And by 1811, the instrument, the clarinet, had already evolved since Mozart's time. And certainly that concerto and the soloist who made it famous early on put the clarinet at the front of the stage rather than within the ensemble only. So very important times for the clarinet, it seems to me. Can you tell us a little bit about the instrument, its evolution, and the importance of these composers to the evolution of the clarinet?
Certainly. So in 1811, Weber wrote not only the concertino, and by the way, he wrote it in 3 days, which is amazing.
That's very Mozartian, isn't it? Yes.
Exactly.
Another connection.
Another connection. And a very common thread in clarinet history is having a clarinet virtuoso be really good friends with a composer. And this started in Mozart's time with Mozart's good friend, Anton Stadler. And Anton Stadler played for Mozart. Mozart knew the clarinet very well, and so therefore was able to write idiomatically for the instrument. The same thing happened with Heinrich Beermann, who was also a very close friend of Carl Maria von Weber. And in 1811, Weber wrote the concertino for Heinrich Beermann, and also in that very same year of 1811, wrote the other two concertos, Concerto 1 and 2, for Beermann. And so Weber was an amazing composer because he knew how to write for the clarinet. He knew what the clarinet could do. And at this time in clarinet history, there were a lot of improvements being made to the instrument. A man by the name of Ivan Müller was working on something called the clarinet omnitonique, which means the clarinet which could play in all keys. Prior to this, we had clarinets that were pitched in C, in D, every key depending on what the orchestra was playing in or what you were playing. So if the piece was in the key of D, the clarinetist had to have a clarinet in D to play. But
Wow.
Ivan Miller created this instrument, and he was trying to get it to pass the review board at the Paris Conservatory. They rejected it because they thought that clarinets in every key that was to be, they wanted to keep that clarinets in every key because they thought that every instrument had its own timbre and tonality sound. But Ivan Miller, actually, he prevailed, and he made his clarinet so that it could play in all the chromatic keys. And so by this time, 1812, there were about 13 keys on the clarinet. Also of significance at this time, I have my clarinet here because I wanted to show, before this, the reed would be played uppermost on the clarinet, so that you would play actually like this, with the reed on the upper lip, okay? However, Heinrich Beermann was one of the first proponents of not doing that, and he wanted to play as we play now, with the reed on the bottom lip. And so there were all these improvements, up to 13 keys, reed on the bottom instead of on the top, and that really affected the tone quality of the clarinet and how the clarinet was held. If you play with the reed on the top, the clarinet would have been held more like an oboe, more out to let the reed vibrate a little bit more. However, Beermann, like I said, he was really after playing with the reed on the bottom, and that gave I think a different kind of a sound and more flexibility to the tone.
Wow. So does that mean that the Mozart clarinet concerto, the reed was played at the top of the mouthpiece as opposed to
Well,
underneath? We
we're
don't
not
know.
we're not really sure. I think it was kind of personal choice and decision. People played
Mhm.
however they could best make a sound. Um,
Sure.
in the very early days of the clarinet, the reed and the barrel were all one piece, and they used to lash the reed on the mouthpiece, and of course they didn't change the reed as often as we do now. So
Wow.
goodness only knows, there are no recordings from back at that time, but the tone has obviously really changed and refined over the years. But the Mozartian clarinet had only 5 keys, which
Wow.
is stunning when you think of technically how difficult the piece is to play.
Indeed. So Stadler must have been extraordinary, as Beermann, as we know from the concertino and the two concerti.
Yeah.
Beermann must have been a monster at the clarinet and
Well,
at the
yes,
top of the game.
absolutely. And Heinrich Beermann was such a virtuoso that a couple other composers actually wrote for him specifically, namely Franz Danzi, who wrote a sonata, and Mendelssohn wrote the two Concertstücke for two clarinets and orchestra. And so Mendelssohn wrote those two Concertstücke actually for Heinrich Berman and his son, Karl. So there's a son, Karl Berman, who other clarinetists would know that Karl Berman wrote many method books. Karl was the son of Heinrich, and he wrote many, many method books for the clarinet, but he was also a virtuoso in his day too.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's a generational talent going on and really helping form what we know as modern clarinet playing. How many keys are on the clarinet now? We were 13 in 1811. How many more were added?
So now we're up to 17.
Okay. And I also know that the clarinet is not all one instrument. In other words, there's an E flat, more soprano clarinet. There's an A clarinet, which is, there are still a few different clarinets. Am I right? That are played in the orchestra, and then certainly a bass clarinet, but that's almost a different instrument.
Absolutely. So the clarinet family is a very large one. We still have the clarinet in C because many composers wrote for the C clarinet, I think because it was just easier to write the score, all the winds in C. So oboes in C, flutes in C, bassoons in C. So let's just write the clarinet in C. So Beethoven wrote some things in C, other composers as well. But so we have a C clarinet. The old clarinet in D has now been replaced with the little E flat clarinet, like in Till Eulenspiegel. We have the A clarinet, which is used a lot in orchestra because of the keys. So it makes it easier for us, instead of playing the B flat clarinet in 5 sharps, we can play it on the A clarinet in 2 flats. And that makes it obviously easier technically for us. Then we have, there's a basset horn, which is kind of like an alto clarinet, and the 2 composers that wrote for that were Mozart and Mendelssohn. Mozart in his serenades, he wrote for regular clarinet and the basset horn, and Mendelssohn also wrote for the basset horn some. And then we have the bass clarinet, which is used frequently in orchestra, and we also have a contralto clarinet, and we have a contrabass clarinet. But those instruments are only used like in a wind ensemble or a clarinet choir situation. They're not used in the orchestra.
And does anyone really own many of those? I mean, I would imagine that it would be institutions that own them, or people that are obsessed with owning the entire collection, I guess.
Correct. Yeah, the contralto and contrabass clarinet would be a college or a university would have those instruments for ensemble playing.
Wow.
Yeah.
And B flat, of course, is the most commonly heard because it fits very perfectly into the band, where the brass instruments, many of them are tuned to B flat as well.
That's right.
Or F, which is, subdominant kind of thing, whatever. So,
yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and when you say easier to play, is that more that it's just easier to read, or in terms of the notation? Because almost completely, with the exception of a C clarinet, a conductor is going to have to be transposing. In other words, seeing a note for the clarinet and knowing that it sounds differently based on the sort of the grand staff.
Right.
But it's all very complicated and fascinating, and it's so easy to go the wrong direction, especially under duress. Like, what note is that? Oh my gosh, what key are you in? Okay, that means,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, unless you've learned grand staff in a the most fluent way possible. But at any rate, fascinating to me. And the 4 keys that have been added since, does that make the Weber concertino easier to play, or Do you use those keys at all anyway in the work? I'm just curious.
Every single key on the instrument is used in his piece. We'll leave it
Including the 4 he didn't have. Is that what I was hearing?
right. The extra keys are basically alternate keys. So
Okay,
there's a way I can play a note on the right hand side, but I can also play it on the left hand side.
I
And
see.
whereas in the past, the player might have had to slide a finger, now we don't have to slide. So that's how that works out.
Okay, so it's more ease of function, just it's just, yeah,
Correct. Yeah.
that's lovely. I'm glad they finally thought of all those.
So it's just more
Um,
keys to learn, that's all. Yeah.
that's right. And let's talk about the Weber concertino. The word concertino obviously means something smaller. So a concerto anywhere between 20 and 30 minutes long, traditionally,
Mhm.
usually in 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 2, but contrasting movements, fast, slow, fast, something like that.
Mhm.
Um, and a concertino is obviously a smaller form. To me, it is a kind of condensed form,
Yes.
one that offers the opportunity to hear contrast, as this one does, and to
Mhm.
have contrasting sections that are like a concerto, but just not spun out and the same on the grand scale of a sonata form. In other
Correct.
words, one that has a lot of development. And the concertino lends itself more to either the rhapsody, which is sort of a planned out cadenza, just starting from here and blossoming out and coming to a conclusion that somehow pulls it all together. Or it can also encompass other forms like theme and variations, which this has
Yes.
a certain amount of that,
Mhm.
so that the audience can thrill at not so much the musical conversation. I mean, not the conversation, I shouldn't say that, but the musical argument. We're not having a big argument about symphonic in symphonic form. We're mostly hearing a beautiful theme that's set out, and then that is allowed to blossom and develop by the brilliance of both the composer, of course, but the soloist who's creating all of the notes put down by the composer. And can you tell us a little bit more specifically about the form and just the layout of this piece?
So it is indeed theme and variations. The piece begins with a slow introduction, and that is followed by the theme. After the theme, we have a series of variations. Each variation gets technically a little bit more difficult. It shows really, I would say that both Weber was really good at using the complete range of the clarinet. The clarinet has to go from extremely low and loud to extremely high and soft. And Weber, he does this in all of his compositions for the clarinet, where he will make you play the very lowest note and jump to the very highest note in the space of a 16th note. And reading about the history of Heinrich Berman, um, Berman was very good at extremes of dynamics, and that's always difficult to do, I think, on any wind instrument, where you have to go from low to high, but also from loud to soft or back and forth. And so you have to have a lot of control to make those contrasts and those jumps happen. So all these themes and variations, each one gets progressively more difficult. They get a little bit faster and a little bit quicker. And then we have the final 6/8 section, which is quite fast. And then there's a con fuoco at the end, which can go even a little bit quicker and is a really brilliant display of technical ability. Yeah.
Yeah. It really is I guess it is a wonderful platform on which to really show off all the virtuosity of the soloist,
Mhm.
and in a very beautiful, elegant way. Of course, von Weber was Beethoven's contemporary, and this being written somewhere between the Beethoven's sixth and seventh symphonies, if I recall. So right in the golden age of
Yes.
the golden middle of Beethoven's ascendancy as the great composer, but von Weber also. And also, I think we forget is that the last opera of Mozart's, the Magic Flute, which was all in German, that started a whole change in the operatic world in Germany, where that started the German opera, where we have Beethoven's Fidelio, which it was a very noble effort and very beautiful and fabulous, but it took so many iterations for Beethoven to try to find that success and to find the right form and all of that. But von Weber did it perfectly well. In fact, he is best known for his great German operas, which led directly into the operas of Wagner, who admired von Weber a great deal.
Yes, and I would just add that all his compositions, all of Weber's compositions for the clarinet reflect his dramatic sense, his operatic sense. And
Indeed.
there's a very dramatic way of writing for the clarinet that is reflected also in his operas. It's like a mini opera for the clarinet, sort of.
Certainly.
Yeah.
I mean, the slow opening
Mhm.
isn't so much a setting of the stage as it might be in an overture or a Haydn or Mozart slow introduction to a symphony, but it's more a recitative, isn't it? It just lends itself to an operatic opening, it seems to me.
Very dramatic.
Yeah, recitative and aria kind of form in some ways, the concertino. So you have been to the front of the Maryland Theater stage and stages that we have performed on before, and I was thinking of the Mozart Clarinet Concerto. And of course, these are two very different works, although they each seek to exploit the great virtuosity of the musicians that they were writing for, both composers. But when you were a student, and I'm just curious, which of the pieces did you gravitate to? Did you learn them at the same time in your studies? When you teach, do you teach the concertino? I'm assuming you teach the Mozart, because that tends to be one of the big audition pieces for orchestras when they are auditioning for principal clarinet players. They often want to hear some portion of the Mozart concerto or another comparable concerto, but usually Mozart, it seems to me.
Mozart was the very first concerto that I learned, and I learned that, I think, initially when I was a freshman in high school, and my teacher at the time said, "Okay, so we're gonna learn to play the Mozart," and that was the first piece, big concerto that I learned, and I think I learned the Weber shortly thereafter. Both were considered contest solos. You would learn them as a student, so that you would audition for things that students here in Maryland are doing, all state kinds of auditions, along with scale preparation and so forth. Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah.
And so in your student, when you teach this piece to students, tell me about that. What do you, I mean, obviously it depends on where the student is in their development and everything, but where does that come in their studies? Where does that fit into what they're doing?
Well, it can start already at the high school level if they are technically proficient enough. So as a wind player, the student has to have already a grasp of all the fundamentals they need to be doing them properly. Breathing, blowing, tonguing, they have to have what we call the finger technique. It has to be good enough. Um, an understanding of scales and the general basic technique of the instrument. If they can't play their scales or arpeggios, then they're not going to be able to play the Weber or even the Mozart, because that is basically um, those are the fundamental things on which these pieces are based. So you have to have a fundamental knowledge of scales and chords. You have to be able to have proper tonguing. And I find that sometimes students do not have these fundamentals for one reason or another, or they're doing them incorrectly or not quite properly. And then that slows their progress down, or they're not quite able to play the piece to tempo, or they have difficulty. There's tone production, which means reed work, understanding, um, what's a good reed, what makes a good reed, what makes a reed not good, and they have to have that understanding and development with reed preparation and so forth. So there are many elements that go into if you're playing a reed instrument, that's always a huge consideration. Um, of course, now we have improved on the plastic reeds. There are colleagues that I know that are experimenting with the new reeds, the plastic reeds that are out on the market.
Wow.
They've improved. Um, I've talked to several of my colleagues, and some actually use them for performances. Um, others do not. I think the, the double reeds, which are made out of plastic, are not as good as the single reeds. But even so, it's a step in the evolving of the instruments to try and get a more consistent sound, so that you don't have to keep changing reeds all the time. It's an enormous amount of work that goes into a cane reed, because it's a product of nature and each one is going to be different. And no matter how much you fuss with it, it's still, after you play on it for a certain amount of time, certain days, it loses its um, good qualities. So you have to always have a lot of reeds ready to go. It's not like, playing a brass instrument where you have the same mouthpiece for several years and you know what's going to happen when you put it up to play. And
Yeah.
um, different different elevations. So like when we go to Frostburg, um, I will not be able to use the same reed in Frostburg that I use in Hagerstown.
Wow. That's just incredible to know that the difference of 1,200 feet or something like that can make a
It's
difference like that.
it's an amazing, the one teacher, professor that I had in graduate school, she always used to play in Denver for the International Clarinet Conventions, and she would always be in a panic, because Denver, being the Mile High City, all her reads had to be totally different than
Wow.
when she was performing in Michigan, or if you're at sea level, then it's yet another different ballgame.
Right. Oh my
So
goodness.
it's
And
always,
that's the reed. That doesn't even begin to discuss the actual instrument, does it? Because I know that uh,
yeah,
there's arguments of who makes the greatest clarinets, and I know that many distinguished makers are here in the United States, but also in France, in Germany, probably in England as well. I'm not sure,
yes,
but I wouldn't be surprised that.
yeah,
And every country takes pride in their
of course,
clarinets. But there are
yeah,
even, and I know this is probably more for students and for outdoor marching bands, but I know that there's plastic clarinets now too. I mean, things
yes,
made from other, and part of that is not am I not mistaken in thinking that the wood that's used for clarinet, whether it's ebony or rosewood or any of those precious woods,
Yes,
are are becoming extinct, frankly,
that's right.
because
So
they've been over harvested, or
yes,
global warming, or whatever it is. Something
that's right.
has sort of
Yes.
taking away that
Mhm.
possibility.
The African blackwood, or sometimes it's called grenadilla, the same wood that's used to make oboes, is really has been so over harvested, that what happens sometimes is they use inferior wood, and then it's
Mhm.
more prone to cracking. But
Mhm.
I'm very sad to say that about 3 weeks ago, I was playing and my A clarinet cracked.
Oh, oh my.
So I had to take that into the shop and get it fixed. So even after the instrument is fully broken in, if the conditions are not good, that means the wood gets to be too dry, just like a violin or stringed
Mhm.
instrument. It has
Mhm.
to be kept hydrated. The humidity level has to be kept up. If the temperature is really cold on stage, like 60 degrees, and then you blow your hot air through it, that can cause the wood an enormous amount of stress.
Oh my
So,
goodness.
yeah, so there's there's always something to worry
Oh
about.
my gosh. And I hope, when it cracked, was it within that situation where the stage was cold and you were blowing hot air through it? Or, oh,
Yes,
what a shame. So that
yes.
was in rehearsal or performance. Oh my gosh. And it can be fixed, though. I'm just curious. I mean, I know
Well,
as a violinist, you can glue things back, but cracks are, kind of,
so, yeah,
can't imagine they're
luckily,
great.
so there are surface cracks on a clarinet, at which this fortunately was. It was from one tone hole to another.
Mhm.
So it was a the repairman had to put a pin in the wood, which is a process where they actually drill a hole on either side of the
Mhm.
crack, and then they put a little tiny pin in there to keep the crack closed. Now,
Wow.
so it's okay. Um, so if the crack is really bad, which means that it would go the uh, through to the inside of the clarinet, then the clarinet is rendered worthless.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
So, because then the crack is so you cannot that can't be fixed.
Mhm.
It's like the
Mhm.
Grand Canyon, and it's
Yeah.
enormous.
Oh my God.
And so,
Well, I'm glad that it could be fixed. I'm glad it
you
could be
know,
fixed, and I know that that's not the instrument you're going to be playing anyway. Um,
yeah,
since we're in E flat, I'm assuming you're playing a B flat instrument.
correct.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Right. Whew. Well, we'll pray for good weather and lots of humidity
Right.
and all of those things. But it's going to be a delightful opportunity to hear you play. You are a magnificent musician. We're just so lucky to have you in the orchestra, and so lucky to be able to have the opportunity to feature you as a soloist with the orchestra in this upcoming series of concerts, both at Frostburg University and at the Maryland Theater on Saturday night and Sunday afternoon.
Well, and I
So,
appreciate the opportunity to play. Thank you. Yeah.
well, it's always an honor, and you do grace us with your
Oh,
wonderful leadership and virtuosity within the orchestra as well. Thank you, Bev, for joining us.
sure.
We look forward to the performance.
I'm looking forward to it too. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks.
And from the Concertino von Weber, we go back a little bit in time to the 1770s, and a moment in time where Mozart's finding himself in Salzburg. He's had some big successes in Europe, and he's home again. He's not super happy to be there, but I think he is already thinking about, where can I go next? How can I escape the overpowering archbishop who really keeps me tied to all my duties with my father for the archbishop, his orchestra, and the church. Mozart was a bit of a rebellious guy. How could he not be? He had been feted at a tiny age by the emperors, empresses, kings, and queens of Europe. And when you're a child prodigy, a child star, you sort of grow up expecting that to continue forever. He's very young here. He's only in 18, 19, but life has changed. Reality hits. He's called back home to go back to work for the Archbishop, but his mind cannot only be occupied by the work, the sacred works and other works that the Archbishop demands of him. He is thinking, what can I write for my next trip to Europe? He's plotting his escape. And at the same time, how fabulous to have come from Europe and heard all the latest music by all the great musicians in the centers that he visits. Not only Haydn, but he knows, he has met or has heard certainly of the Chevalier Saint-Georges, Joseph Boulogne in France, who works for Marie Antoinette, and many, many other great musicians. So he writes a series of symphonies, one of which is the symphony that we're going to perform. And it is, to my mind, one of his most perfect symphonies. I don't know if it is one of his greatest symphonies, but it certainly is one of his most perfect, and maybe one of the earliest of his most perfect forms. For this piece, his 29th Symphony in A major, and we recently screened Amadeus again for some of our patrons recently here in Hagerstown, and what was wonderful is to watch a scene in which Salieri is looking at all of these manuscripts that Mozart's wife has brought to Salieri in a kind of audition in order for Mozart to get work. Salieri is connected to the Emperor of Austria, and therefore his approval would get Mozart some work. And you watch Salieri looking at these manuscripts, and the sound of Symphony 29 comes by, and Salieri is just dumbfounded at the perfection of it, and says so before dropping all of the music onto the floor in just great jealousy and walking away and turning his back on Mozart. Now we know truly that didn't happen, and that there was a cordial relationship and one of mutual admiration between Salieri and Mozart. At any rate, Mozart's 29th Symphony is a work of perfection. Why is that? Well, in some ways, what he does is, this is one of the works that puts the idea of sonata form and symphonic form as it was received by Beethoven and others, even unto today. The idea of development, the idea of setting forth an argument between two contrasting melodies, themes, that then create the opportunity for some sort of working out, which we call development musically. And often then a conclusion which has an added on part, which we call a coda, that might bring that argument a little bit further, that conversation a little bit further. And in this symphony, in literally all of the movements, we have that sense of development or a sense of conversation that really is the epitome of what we call sonata form, a first theme followed by a contrasting theme. One or both of those themes are developed in a middle section, and then we come to a recapitulation that has further discussion in a coda. Many of Mozart's earlier symphonies are based on an earlier form called a sinfonia or an overture, an Italian overture, which is more about contrasting movements, contrasting feelings, fast, slow, fast, for instance. And in this case, the four specific movements, a first fast, more or less heroic first movement, a second more aria-like, song-like movement, followed by a dance movement, and then followed by either a rondo or a quick movement at the end that is usually theatrical, or a sense of triumph at the end. Some journey through four movements is what we expect of a symphony, and we get something close to that here, and in its most impeccable form. First movement, two different themes, one in the A major, and then the other in the dominant, which is what we expect, E major. It works itself out. What we hear immediately is an octave, a falling octave. And in some ways, the way that he works this out, which finds its way into the last movement, the octave, we'll hear it again, is very conversational. You almost feel like the first two notes, the simple octave, it's audacious in some ways, and but it's also very conversational. It's a place where it's just one note displaced by a few steps, and for the audience, it's going to be the fundamental beginning. But it somehow invites you in. It's an extremely welcoming initial gesture. And the working out of this octave, and then moving up to another one, and then moving up to another one before it falls back, is so gracefully done. And so it is so simple, and yet it is incredibly worked out, as only Mozart could do. Very much reminding me about Pulcinella using ancient forms, but bringing his own understanding of those forms into refashioning to make it inimitably Mr. Stravinsky. So Mozart takes just a scale or an octave and makes it his own through his working it out. Second movement also has development, which is surprising. It's not just a pretty theme, but it actually has a contrast where the second movement itself begins in the subdominant, a place in D major, which allows a sort of sense of relaxation, and this is where the dynamics of keys come in to the symphony in ways that are going to inform composers ever onward. This sense of harmony is having drama to it, and in relation to each other, and in big block forms. This is something that is being developed right at this moment in 1774 by a 19-year-old man. And this sense of coming back into a relaxed key also allows us to appreciate the elegance and the ease at which he can write a beautiful melody that is spun out in and developed throughout. The third movement has a jaunty first minuet. It almost hops along. It's almost impudent. You can hear the young man just on the verge of blowing a raspberry, but not quite. There's an elegance to it. There's a gallantry to it, possibly thinking back to the ancient form, the hocket, or the gallant hop kind of music of France that he might have heard and seen. And then it's followed by a trio. The second part of the minuet and trio is absolutely gloriously elegant. It glides along, it dips and bows. Again, this idea of contrast. And here he's using the key of the first movement and its dominant for the trio. So we have a sense of rising up for the trio, even as the elegance is shown forth. I think Mozart is writing these symphonies with the idea that they would be audition pieces to maybe get a big job in a bigger musical center, maybe present these symphonies to a person of the aristocracy, a person of influence, much like the movie that we saw, Amadeus, a few days ago. This idea of using them as part of his resume, as a portfolio work. And then we move to the last movement, which really is like lightning caught in a bottle. It's wonderful. It's full of fast scales. And again, the octave that we hear at the very beginning, which is very welcoming and very elegant. Now it's been recast into a finale of brilliance and of great virtuosity. And so we see Mozart at his most genius best in what I call a perfect symphony, in that it really lays out in a beautiful way all that we have come to understand as the symphonic form. It is already there in the 19-year-old's at the tip of his pen, and continues to delight us. And again, there aren't too many notes, as the emperor in Amadeus says. They're just exactly the right amount of notes in Mozart's symphony in A major. And looking forward to a fabulous concert in which all three of these works have some resonance with each other, whether it is through Mozart and his connection to the clarinet and its development into the 19th century, or a looking back at the music, the elegant music of the 18th century, and the music that just happened right before Mozart's time, brought into the 20th century and given new dancing shoes. All of this speaks to each other in terms of elegance, recognition of form, but also the idea of moving it into a more modern world, into being the latest and the brightest and the best.